This brain food lunch and learn series, our topic is demystifying artificial intelligence. We are blessed to have with us the brilliant and interesting Sara Polak. Sara is an Oxford-educated cognitive evolutionary anthropologist and archaeologist working in artificial intelligence. Sara has worked in startups in London and in LA and is now back home in the Czech Republic after 10 years to help centralize the innovation and technological environment through the adoption of cutting-edge technology. Wow, what a big task. Fun facts about Sara: she has also an MBA and a DBA and a PhD in exploring the evolution of music and the effect of Mozart's compositions on human cognition. She is a British comedy junkie and is writing a book on memes. Sara is interesting. So she will do a presentation followed by a Q&A period. It is with great pleasure that I yield the mic to Sara. Sara, welcome.
There we go. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear now.
Fantastic. That's always a good sign of someone who calls themselves an AI expert and they can't unmute themselves on Zoom. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge honor for me to be able to talk to you today. Dr. Christopher Washington and I kind of met on Clubhouse and on Twitter, and actually our meeting and us being in touch like this is, I think, the prime example of the fact that we're now living in a completely different society. We're no longer simply constrained by geopolitical boundaries and like the people that we meet on the street or maybe at work. We're genuinely becoming a global organism, and we're becoming and starting to form global cloud communities, which from an anthropological and archaeological perspective is actually fascinating. And it shows that the huge effect that technologies and historical technologies have on humans and the way that we function. I am perfectly aware that you must all be like sick and tired of panel discussions and online stuff, because that's what's been happening for the last year. So my aim isn't to show you like a very dry explanation of what artificial intelligence is. What I want to do is show you AI as the next stone tool, as the next steam engine. It affects your everyday lives without you maybe realizing. And it is extremely important for us to understand it in its core and in its roots so that we can grasp it effectively and become an effective part of this new world. Sounds extremely eerie and like pseudo Illuminati, but like there is a new dawn in terms of society structure, and it's important to grasp the latest technologies to be able to cope with that, regardless of where you're from and your background. So just to give you like a very, very brief lowdown, the key concepts for today, and I'm more than happy to share this presentation afterwards and to stay in touch. So don't worry about taking notes, just listen and yawn if it gets too boring, or just stop me. But we'll be talking about the importance of multidisciplinarity and the importance of historical context, the importance of digital literacy, the concept of cloud society, the idea that AI is truly a new beginning in many ways, like electricity or the stone tools or the printing press once was, but then also that AI isn't magic. AI is sadly being mystified massively by the media to not very great extents, because frankly, it's not Terminator, it's not iRobot. AI is a sophisticated mincing machine for data. It's like a sexy calculator, but it isn't anything that's going to purposefully kill you or that's got any ideas of its own. It's a completely like dead system. It's a set of algorithms. And I really want to show you on concrete examples how that's the case, and how the fear that we have, the natural fear from new technologies isn't really founded in this case. It's more the way that we use it that we should be wary of. So because there's a lot to talk about, and I've got now a beautiful shade of green, so I look like something out of a Disney villain movie. I should have really thought about the color coordination for this presentation. But there'll be 4 parts to it. First, I'll be discussing historical technologies, just to be able to show artificial intelligence in more historical context, so that we take it down a notch. Basically, we stop kind of freaking out about AI and we just look at the precedents that have been here and the socioeconomic and kind of even geopolitical effects that it had on our history and the way that it evolved. Secondly, I'll be demystifying AI, so talking about artificial intelligence as a technology and maybe debunking some untruths about it and like showing AI for what it really is. Then, because these are all like airy-fairy philosophical concepts, showed on concrete examples, so AI around us. And then finally, this is just me, so I'm sure that there's a million people who disagree with me, but from what I've seen and from my humble experience, the future with AI that awaits us. So let's kick off with historical technologies. You can see the Rosetta Stone. I actually used to work in the British Museum one summer, and Dr. Richard Parkinson, who now leads the Egyptology department at Oxford, was the keeper of the Rosetta Stone at the time, and he became a friend of mine. Amazing guy. And he was basically saying, do you realize what deciphering the hieroglyphics meant? Like, it wasn't really about deciphering hieroglyphics. It was a massive, massive power move at the time when France and Turkey and Greece and the British Empire were all struggling to take control of Egypt. Deciphering hieroglyphics was a massive political deal. So it's a really interesting thing to see that even something so, for what us might seem as a very kind of like highly academic, like unless you're an Egyptologist, it doesn't concern you. Back in the day, the Rosetta Stone, there was actually a contract written up so that the British can take it to the British Museum. And the Rosetta Stone remains one of the most controversial objects in the history of everything, because everyone wants it in their museum, but because it's that symbol of encryption, it's a symbol of mastering another culture, it's a symbol of taking something over. And it's a symbol of technological progress because it laid the foundations of Egyptology and of the understanding of ancient societies. So even a stupid slab of stone, like the Rosetta Stone when it was created, it was worthless. It was basically like a billboard, like it didn't have any value at all. But it became an embodiment of understanding technology and using the latest technology of the day to decipher old text. That basically, it shows the socioeconomic importance of that. Similarly with lithics, so I actually can't help this as an archaeologist, just very, very briefly. The way that we were able to use stone implements, these are some examples from Ethiopia, to be able to get to the bone marrow in bones, like for example, large carnivores like lions aren't able to. This was Homo habilis roughly 1.6 million years ago, but actually we see already Australopithecines maybe 3 million years ago, the kind of Lucy type characters already attempting this. And you started working lithics into specific shapes, which in itself had a lot of social capital. If I'm being, again, prosaic about it, if you could make nicer stone implements, it was much more likely that another Homo habilis would go out with you because you were cool and you held that kind of artistic kind of craftsmanship that was hugely valued at the time socially. But you're also able to get to the bone marrow. That's a massive dose of protein, and that massive dose of protein is going to do something to your brain. And it's absolutely no wonder that there was a massive cognitive and neurologically expansive explosion after the adoption of lithics, because suddenly we had a new source of energy that we previously didn't have. And obviously your brain's going to get bigger. So what's going to happen? You're going to start trying to tame nature around you or interact with it in a way that is comfortable to you. Like, imagine you're a caveman and you're sitting there and you're relying on the sun to come up because otherwise you can't see because your eyes are not that great. And you're relying on the fact when the sun goes down. The moment the sun goes down, things start to hunt you. You're not very quick. You're not that clever, and you don't have that many tools to arm yourself against a saber-toothed lion. So you're going to need to start to improvise, and you're going to start using technologies and be able to do that. So things like fire, and the moment you can start not only using the raw bone marrow, but also processing meat, these things really go hand in hand, and they might seem stupid and very distant to us now. And obviously this is a bit of a fun example of a Neanderthal, or maybe more Homo heidelbergensis, doing a bit of cheeky algebra on the walls. But you're going to start and improvise, and there are going to be byproducts, but also like concrete social changes that are going to come out of that. So say that now you're not restricted anymore by daylight, and you're sitting, but you're still sitting in a cave. Like, you don't have Facebook, like you're not talking to each other because you don't have really language. So you're sitting there. What are you going to do? You're going to start drawing on the walls. Like, I remember my old professor at Oxford saying, actually, like, human history is very, very simple. We don't need to pretend to be overly academic about it. There were people like you and me, they had the same problems, the same frustrations. So if you live for 35, 40 years and you're just sitting in a cave day after day, you're going to get bored, and you're going to want to express your symbolic nature somehow. that is evolving thanks to your bigger brain. So suddenly you start drawing, you start playing bone flutes, you start talking, vocalizing, you start creating symbolic behavior, you start creating symbolic patterns, and lo and behold, you have language. And it's a very small step from that to writing. And it's a very small step from that to artificial intelligence. One of my best friends, who happens to actually be the author of Word2Vec, which is the basis for Google Translate, he's Czech, Tomáš Mikolov, he actually uses evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary theory to come up with his artificial intelligence research, because these things, the way that human societies evolved and the way that artificial intelligence research is going forward, are hugely connected. So this is the first intersect that we see of multidisciplinarity and understanding our own past being really important. I mentioned writing. Now, the writing press was a huge deal, because before you had, this is, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest. It's very, very similar to the Bible, which is very interesting and another academic debate in itself. But it's from the Middle East. It's very, very interesting, written in cuneiform epic about this dude who was great and managed to do everything and was just fantastic. This is the Treaty of Kadesh, which was a treaty that Ramses II drew up with Syria after absolutely beating the living daylights out of them. And it's actually the first peace treaty in the world. So they may look similar to the untrained eye, and like my eye is trained and they still look pretty similar to me, even though I'm an archaeologist. But what is interesting is that suddenly you were no longer sitting in a cave. You were able to, as a society, codify certain things. And codifying things becomes very, very important, because suddenly more people can read them. And when people can read them, people can transfer information in a lot more stable way, because suddenly it's not Chinese whisper, suddenly it's actually written on a slab of clay. So the meaning of information, the meaning of data, the data transfer that is happening between humans has been accelerating thanks to the development of new technologies. And you see the debate that is going around, for example, artificial intelligence and fake news now, and the way that social media enables the spread of information. On principle, there's zero difference between that and, for example, codifying the Declaration of Independence. Say that the founding fathers just came to the British Empire and they said, look, we declare independence, thank you very much, goodbye. It would have had, I'm not sure, quite the same effect as if they actually wrote it down on a piece of paper that you can plaster somewhere and say, hey, look, we've got it written down and we signed it. Is these small ritualizational aspects where people use the latest technologies, and yes, writing is a technology, to be able to show some form of identity that is very, very similar to the principles of AI and not that cognitively different. So, and I'll show you further examples of this as we go along. Gunpowder, again, so Napoleon obviously used it to great extent, partly also in Egypt to colonize that and pretend to be extremely important there. But gunpowder, Jared Diamond is a fantastic book. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's a bit simplistic in some ways, but actually what it talks about is the fact that you're able to control steel and the military and basically like the intimidation tactics, you're going to have a socioeconomic benefit out of that. And you're going to be able to control other people, or you're going to have a leverage in conversations. Again, the discussion that's going on now in regards, for example, to the latest EU regulation that came out yesterday, and the way that China is, for example, developing artificial intelligence, which is funny, gunpowder came out of China, so we're having that discussion all over again. It's the same discussion. It's just that the topic is different, and it's AI, and it's using AI as a leverage and AI research, and the AI researchers that these countries are trying to push between themselves and attract them to make the living conditions for them good so that their brains go to that specific area. But it's the same with gunpowder, and gunpowder was one of the most precious traded commodities. It was one of the reasons why the Silk Road even started existing and why we even discovered the part of that world, apart from also spices. But that gunpowder starts somewhere very like simple, like in a, I don't know, like on the battlefield, and it can end up basically creating this catalyst of thought that ends up with the combustion engine and ends up with inventions like the V2 that was during the Second World War, which Tintin's moon rocket was modeled on. You can see that a very small technological change, that small beat of the butterfly wings, can have huge implications in the future. Now, guessing the future technological innovation is very much like using the crystal ball. Like, we can never know where it's truly going to lead. But that's why analyzing history is so important, that basically gunpowder coming out of China is going to have direct implications hundreds and thousands of years on when the Second World War is being fought. So we need to think about these kind of historical relations when we develop artificial intelligence as well, and be very mindful of how we use it. Similarly, I think a beautiful case in which to show this is trade. The East India Trading Company is a wonderful, well, not wonderful at all actually, but an interesting example of where, again, trading a precious commodity can lead to complete structural change in society. I'll be discussing at the very end of this presentation what I think is going to happen next in regards to AI, but think about the fact that because of tulips and cinnamon, the East India Trading Company basically became an independent state. They started creating factories which were independent duty-free zones in India, for example, and to the extent that they actually took more out of India than the British Parliament. Now, the British Parliament got pissed off, as they always do when someone else takes money that they believe should be theirs. And I'm sure you guys in the US know only too well in regards to 1776. But basically what this led to was the British Parliament taking more power and taking more regulation to the point that the East India Trading Company could no longer exist. The trading companies, Sweden had its own, Finland had its own, the Dutch obviously did, the British, the French. So there were many trading companies. And for example, the relationships that they had with pirates who stole from under their noses is very, very similar to the relationship that modern academia in terms of AI has with hackers, and the relationship that some states have with people like Edward Snowden. I'm not coming on either side of the argument here. I just want to show that these historical parallels happen and have always happened and have had a very, very significant effect on the way that our modern nation states are structured. Here's an example of the Silk Road. I have to be very careful in this presentation not to go too down the archaeological hole, because for me, then there's no coming back. And this is indigo, which is just another really interesting example. It came into the English language, I think, in 1632, but I need to double check that. And it shows that how trade and trading precious commodities actually even linguistically affects us. And the fact that I now say indigo, and you can imagine what that is, that's a result of hundreds of years of wars, of social change, of trade, that is all enabled by modern technologies. And AI is going to have very similar effects. And at the end of the day, things like the Federal Reserve are very, very closely related to something like trade as well, where you can see that the moment that trade becomes codified and regulated and becomes intrinsically tied with the state, you're basically getting a completely new social structure that the Federal Reserve very, very strongly codified, for example, when it created the dollar. That is something that is now hotly being discussed in regards to the uprising of crypto and things like Bitcoin, because suddenly these things are being put into question. And again, we see that technologies are changing the status quo, or at least questioning it. And of course, to end on a merry note, our little historical window, whenever there's a crisis and whenever there's a pandemic, there's oftentimes the latest technologies that come to use there. So for example, during the Great Plague or the Black Death in Europe, a lot of really strong philosophical theses came out of that. Actually, one of the main ones was the tendency to divide the state from the church. And another very strong one was to divide Catholics and Protestants, because one of the reasons that also created that was the printing press, which was another new technology that basically gave the Bible to the masses. And imagine the contrast that you're going to church every Sunday and you listen to a sermon for 3 hours in Latin and you basically have no idea what's going on, and then you go home again. But imagine that you suddenly go to church, you understand what's going on, you're able to question the person that is saying it to you, and then you can go home and have your own bit of the Bible and actually read it and verify what's being said. That's a very, very big psychological change. And when that happens at scale, you're really looking at quite a strong social change, which is actually, in this case, a religious civil war that is having implications in Europe still until today, because the differences between previously and even now Catholic countries like Spain and Protestant countries like Britain, they're huge, and it has huge social implications. So it's good to see what the things like the printing press, what effect that can have even hundreds of years on. The steam engine. So I know that this title is title of the AI, the steam engine of the 21st century. And I think that this is maybe a little bit less abstract than things like indigo and gunpowder. I used to live in the UK for almost 10 years, and you can still see the results of the Industrial Revolution there. You had people moving from villages to cities, but for example, you had no sewage system, you had no schools, you had no hospitals, and all of that had to be somehow like punkily put together with like a bit of Victorian philanthropy, a bit of let's just let them die of cholera and see what happens. But there's a huge generation where, for example, the kids didn't go to school because they had to go to the mines. And you can still see that in parts of the UK where textile industry was, for example, really widespread. The accent there is different. Anthropologically is a completely different place. The education levels are different until now. And it shows you that modern technology, if used badly and if concentrated in bad places and if distributed badly by the state, can have it can ruin people's lives for centuries if it's used badly. And it can affect things like literacy levels. And of course, we're now talking about AI taking over people's jobs. I don't believe that that's going to be the case, because AI is projected to create like 1.5 times more jobs than it will take. But you need to reskill those people. So suddenly, again, you're looking at a very social dimension. And the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of times where that failed. And where that failed, or at least appeared to fail, it's no coincidence that Marx and Engels, now I'm from an ex-communist country, so you can probably guess my interpretation of those two chaps. But this is not a political presentation. However, it must be said that they were observing a phenomenon in society where technology was having an effect on the class system, was having an effect on the way that people were brought up. Suddenly, things like autocratic power was being questioned. Even now, the monarchy with the death of Prince Philip is being hugely questioned, and like whether they're needed during a time of a crisis. So all these huge questions often come with new technology being suddenly rapidly scaled in society and people not knowing what to do with it, basically. Another beautiful, I really like these old-timey photos, so I decided to put a few of them in there just to yeah, and here you go. This is the kind of the social change that it can lead to. I myself am no fan of any revolutions, because often the situation afterwards is much worse than it was before. But it's a fact of life, and it's a reality of life that they will happen in one way or another. And we just need to make sure, because we've had a lot of them in the past, and we would be frankly stupid not to turn to history to understand how our future can evolve, to make sure that that doesn't happen with something like artificial intelligence, and that we don't have the rise of some kind of dystopia that could be really unpleasant for all of us. The interesting thing, much more than politics, because I'm a hugely like apolitical person, is the effect that that industry and technology can have on science. So Darwin actually directly inspired from some of the things that were brought about by the Industrial Revolution, because he was observing the phenomena around him. So the knock-on effect and the multidisciplinarity academically, where AI research can lead to research even in other areas, or vice versa, is another really important thing to bear in mind, is that academic kind of background and that like academic world that can really feed off each other during times of the social and technological upheaval. Electricity, again, maybe a little bit closer to home. Poor Nikola Tesla, he never got the credit. This is, by the way, if you want a piece of trivia, if you want to read up on the World Columbia Exposition 1893, please do so. This was all constructed for it. The whole thing was electrified, the White City. I'm a massive fan of steampunk, so it really like gets me going. And this was like the height of electricity. Like electricity was being, like manifest destiny was being discussed in the US. Electricity was being put everywhere. The US was being electrified. It was seen as a sign of progress. But it was actually a hugely political lobbyist agenda, because Westinghouse versus Westinghouse, who had Tesla under his wing, versus Edison. It was the current wars, AC versus DC. And you had propaganda posters like this, like people basically just walking nearby electrical wires and dying. Of course, the things like the electrical chair were introduced, I think 1888 as well. So the social discussion around what technology can do to you, and the big political contracts and like lobby contracts that were associated with that were phenomenal. So again, something interesting to read up on. But I'd be lying if I said that this exact same thing wasn't going on with AI right now. The world is a little bit more muddied. This is the sub-Atlantic cable, by the way, that's still keeping us going. But it was partly this upheaval about electricity that we're able to have AI in the first place, because if we didn't have computers and things like the internet, thanks to the cable, we wouldn't be able to do anything that we do now. So it's interesting to see the connection not only between the socioeconomic changes and the historical technologies, but also between the kind of evolution of the technologies themselves and how they link to one another. Oh, and this is the cable route, which is just a fascinating thing. And also shows what the important points of contact are seen to be. And then, of course, we have AI. Poor Alan Turing, he cracked Enigma during the Second World War. Basically, he was a complete genius, a mathematician from Cambridge, worked in Bletchley Park. The Enigma was a machine that was kind of taken from a Nazi submarine, basically undamaged, and it was like a fancy copywriter that the Nazis used to encrypt their messages. Alan Turing, basically through a set of primitive algorithms, was able to create the Bomba, which was a machine that de-encrypted that. But he did it in precisely the same way that Champollion used the Rosetta Stone, going back to the very beginning, to decipher the hieroglyphics. Champollion used the cartouches, which were the names of emperors or names of pharaohs that kept repeating. So I think in his case, it was Ptolemy and Cleopatra. And Turing did the same. He was able to see that the Nazis always did two things. They put Heil Hitler everywhere, and they also always gave the weather report. And he was able to decipher those two things. And with that, he was able to do the basis of the de-encryption. Exactly the same is being done in AI today. We're still using the Turing test to analyze the strength of chatbots, although that's also a hugely PR bubble that I'll get to later. But Turing was phenomenal in this. He was then chemically castrated by the state for being gay, and I think he committed suicide actually in the end. So he basically won the war for the Allies slightly, and then was murdered for it. So again, it shows you how extremely politicized technologies can be. But it's a really nice example where we can see what connects all of these dots of all these historical technologies that might seem as a bit of a goulash right now. But we basically have widespread socioeconomic impact of every single one of these technologies. Also overhyped PR. Like the East India Trading Company was a bunch of pirates who they didn't know what they were doing. They were just sailing around the world with a lot of gunpowder, trying their luck. It's the same with electricity. Like Edison, like he didn't. It's not like how he was a genius and like he didn't stand on the shoulders of giants and some randomly like invented the light bulb. Like he was an excellent scientific politician. So PR and branding plays a very, very big part in this. And of course, massive politicization of the media, of the media, of course, but of the idea. So this is, I'm not trying to be overly skeptical, but it is important to bear these things in mind, that AI is not like a bunch of robots sitting in a cellar somewhere. It's a massively politicized social tool. And we need to bear that in mind, because it will really flavor the way that we do research into the future and the way that we adopt it into our everyday lives. One important thing is that we need to study the evolution of impact. Writing is a very, very curious thing with that, that basically it was invented, okay, some Egyptologists and Mesopotamia archaeologists would argue, but roughly 3,500 BC in the Middle East, in the shape of cuneiform, that basically arose from seals that were being put on bags of grain to say, no, this grain is mine, and then that became codified and somehow became writing. But it took almost 5,000 years until people became literate. Like even in Victorian England that I was showing you earlier, kids didn't know how to read or write because they had to go to school. So this is the really important thing. We can't afford 5,000 years of us, like all of us in this room, not being at least basically literate in the principles of artificial intelligence, because we just don't have that time. Because it's one thing like, yeah, fine, like living in a medieval society and like occasionally writing manifests to each other. But it's like a whole different thing when you've got 7 billion people connected by the internet. You need to trade. You're already kind of partly living in the cloud, and you are being influenced by artificial intelligence every day. So that's why I'm so passionate about adopting it quickly, and to make sure that I'm not even really interested in these like fancy like congresses and like scientists just talking to each other. We need to make sure that it's the people that get educated. So I'm actually leading the Czech version of the Finnish course, Elements of AI, here in the Czech Republic, which is aimed to teach anyone from like a 10-year-old to my grandmother about artificial intelligence. I'm also writing a book about it because I think it's really important. That's not me putting myself in some kind of messianic position, but it's just very frustrating to see how long writing took to get imprinted in society, pun intended. And we just can't afford that kind of timeline with artificial intelligence. So, demystifying AI. What is AI? I'll tell you what it's not. It doesn't have conscience. It's not iRobot. Even the Boston Dynamics videos, I love Boston Dynamics, but they spend months creating those videos. The robot will fall over 2,000 times and it'll manage to walk 3 times, and they'll cut those 3 times. They'll make a PR video out of it. I'm not trying to be mean. This is not me like dissing anyone. I just want you to know, because I've been in many startups, I've seen how the marketing is made. You're seeing the tip of the iceberg. 90% of what happens in AI now is trial and error and a lot of fails. That doesn't mean that AI isn't fantastic, but what it is, the stage that it's in now is like a glorified meat mincer. You put data in, like raw meat, it processes it, basically whirs it together, and it gives you an output, minced meat. But it's not more sophisticated than that. The artificial intelligence that you're used to from movies would be the equivalent of leaving meat frozen in the freezer, putting the mincing machine on the table, going back to work, and expecting to come back to like duck confit with Bordeaux wine. Like it's that massive like leap of, no, AI can't do that right now. It can mince the meat, but that's it. So again, I'm happy to have follow-up and discussions on this, but it's just important to understand that we don't have artificial general intelligence. We have artificial intelligence that is using that mincing meat machine for very specific tasks, automating them, making them faster, going through huge chunks of data in a rapid amount of time that us humans are incapable of doing, but it is not more sophisticated than that. And if one rule of thumb, if anyone talks about AI being like sentient, it's not true. And I can tell you this for a fact, like I don't know many things in life, but unless we define conscience as like something being able to process data, then we don't have conscious AI that thinks for itself. And I'll get back to more concrete examples of that. Roughly, AI and like all these fancy words that you're used to hearing divides into 2 groups, like the symbolic approach that was very popular in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, which is just a bunch of rules, like if you can't do this, then you can't do that, and then like basically making them into complicated trees. That's obviously very, very restrictive, and it's also very slow. Machine learning is much faster because you basically, for example, show the algorithm, like your task is to be able to detect whether the image is that of a cat. So you show it 2,000 images of a dog, 2,000 images of a cat, you tell it this is a cat, this is a dog. But then if you show it a picture of an elephant, the AI has got no idea. It has never seen an elephant before in its life. So it's similar a bit to like a child learning to read. Like you need to tell it very explicitly. You need to give it a lot of data. You need to have a lot of patience. Tell what's what, and then it'll be able to give you some kind of output with some degree of precision. So you basically have like computer science, then you have AI, then you have machine learning, and then you have deep learning. So it's like an onion. So if you're used to seeing these things around you, that's how they come together. I can't resist memes, of course, as well. So I'm putting those there to illustrate a little bit more what I mean. So the top myths are that artificial general intelligence exists. It doesn't. There's people working on it. I'm actually a part of a team that's working on investigating how it could come about, but we're far away from that. Some people think 10 years, some people think 200 years, some people think never. It's also, however, not just a phase. It's not just a sexy buzzword. AI is here to stay because it's a fundamental way in which we process data. So it's very, very important that we learn to live with it. It's not just something that's like going to come and go, like, I don't know, cronuts. It's going to be here for a long time. Big data, that was a huge buzzword. Like, oh, if you want to mean anything in the world, you need big data. No, because if that data is bad, and if all that, back to the idea of the cats, if you want to learn what a, I don't know, cat looks like, and you only show it pictures of cats, then it's just going to know what a cat looks like. But it's going to tell you with 100% confidence. But it's not telling you with 100% confidence because it knows. It's telling you with 100% confidence because it's never seen anything else. So especially things like neural networks, they need huge amounts of data, however, that are very well labeled and that are clean. Like it's the same thing like putting, I don't know, a bit of chicken into the mincing machine and expecting foie gras to come out. It's not. So you need to make sure that you know that what you put in is going to reflect the quality of what you get out. And things like, for example, racial bias is one of those things. It always infuriates me to see like PR headlines like, oh, this algorithm is racist. It's not. It's getting racist data, yeah, because like the data set is like extremely biased. The AI has got nothing to do with that. It's not choosing one over the other because it's got some kind of conscience. Like it's getting very, very biased data, and it's that bias that we must work with. But we mustn't work with it by making it by artificially constricting it. We must work with it by making that necessary social change that needs to happen, like we've seen in the case of the Industrial Revolution. So very, very important. It's not about big data, it's about smart data. And finally, the big myth is that theory and practice are the same, that the AI that you see being written about in articles, that's how it happens. It doesn't. I'll give you a very concrete example from industry. I used to work in a startup that used to listen to machines, and on the basis of sound, it was able to predict whether the machines would break or not, theoretically saving the owner of said machine that costs God knows how many millions of euros. It didn't work because you have to put a sensor onto the machine. That sensor has to collect vibrations, so that's what sound is. It then has to transfer them into digital, which is a huge leap in itself, because if it's hot, or if people are singing nearby, or if people keep tripping over the wires, or if there's a lot of dust in the factory, that's not going to happen as easily. Then someone has to sit in front of the monitor looking at endless spectrograms and labeling them and saying this frequency is still okay, this frequency is not okay. And then you send them a warning signal if something's like looks slightly weird, maybe as a sound. And 5 times out of 10, that's going to be completely inaccurate because someone just tripped over the wire and you detected a complete anomaly that had nothing to do with whether the machine was broken or not. So practice is dirty. It's almost primitive. And this is really, really important to realize. It's the same with things like DeepMind. DeepMind are great. They do a lot of cool stuff. They've got excellent PR. A lot of the demos like AlphaGo and StarCraft that they modeled, they're very, very carefully modeled, almost like surgically kind of clean clinical scenarios. Often what happens is that you change one variable in the data and the demo doesn't work anymore. It's just something that's like done to please the journalist. But then if you actually need to put it into practice, it doesn't really work. So just be wary of that, and it's definitely better to err on the side of skepticism with AI PR headlines than optimism. Because it's a bubble. And again, I think this was just an excuse for me to put some steampunk imagery in there. However, there's the funding in the billions of dollars into AI is increasing, a huge amount. And I see this in investors as well. They're often not that well educated about what AI actually is. And the startup bubble and the fact that everyone's becoming frustrated with startups because like, oh yeah, you always promise something and you can't deliver. In many ways, it's a pyramid scheme, because like what you do is you buy a bunch of MacBooks, you do a cool logo, you do a cool website, you say you're doing AI-based technology that's basically just glorified like if statements. You get a $5 million investment, and lo and behold, 3 years on, you're still not making a profit. Yeah, you're not making a profit because the product that you're selling doesn't exist or like is not technologically feasible. So I'm not saying this is the case for all startups. If anyone's a proponent of entrepreneurialism, it's me, and like I love startups. but it is becoming a bubble. And COVID has really shown that. Like, so many startups went bust because they weren't able to keep up the charade anymore. So again, very important social dimension worth bearing in mind. Multidisciplinarity is going to be king. I hear increasingly that AI is going to take my job. It's scaring people. This statistic is something that's on one hand great, like, yeah, okay, 97 million new jobs versus 85 million lost. But if we as a society don't put the effort into educating people about what AI is, they're not going to reskill. They're not going to have the psychology. They're not going to have the courage to go into that new job that involves AI, because there is going to be that that kind of technological elite that's going to say, you didn't study AI at university. Oh, darling, you can't work here. No, like, anyone can learn AI. Like, its principles are actually not that complicated. It's just churning data. And yeah, if you want to be a top researcher, obviously that takes immense craft, and I have immense respect for those people. But anyone can reskill. Like, you can do so many things with AI, and you don't even need to program it. You can just use it intelligently and like use it to give you the data insights that you need. You can be, for God's sake, I'm an archaeologist and I work in AI. So the possibilities are endless, but the institutions and the structures are not hugely, especially in Europe, they're very conservative, and they're not hugely used to conservative in the sense that they're scared of innovation. So multidisciplinarity is very, very important, as well as ethics and crisis management. And that kind of ties in with politics. So it is important to bear ethics in mind, and bear when something like the crisis comes. I believe that it's the absolute duty of society to skill people in new innovations, because otherwise people are going to be dying. And to give you a concrete example, here in the Czech Republic, we actually started off the pandemic very, very well. The first wave was handled very, very well. What was handled very badly, and almost we hit the headlines in the world for being like the worst in COVID, was the vaccine distribution. Because for some reasons, possibly to do with corruption, the logistics of distributing the vaccines that we had wasn't put into place. So basically it was an extremely centralized, slow system. So the vaccines were lying, rotting in the fridges, and they weren't getting to people. There's a digital platform based on maybe machine learning that tells you, look, this place in the country needs them really urgently. Let's kind of divert logistics into that area. It's a very, very basic platform that works on the basis of Uber that you could construct, or that already exists right now. But it wasn't done because it wasn't in the interests of various groups, and it was and the state just didn't know how to function with the new technologies, because people in the state sector weren't educated in that regard. But the moment that you're not vaccinating people for 4 months, people are going to die. And when politics becomes involved in new technologies and adopting them in society, much like Edison was with the electrification of America, it's just very, very important bearing that dimension in mind. And again, the media often isn't helping, because if people are going to be scared, even if the state by some miracle does come up with an efficient solution, good luck implementing that. We had the smart quarantine. That was actually a very, very good move, where the state said, okay, look, there's an app, you can log in, and then we can basically monitor whether you came into contact with an infected person. But because people don't trust the state, they didn't put their data in. So it's that, again, people not trusting the tech, not trusting the institutions, and then they just say, look, I don't want anything to do with this. But again, in times like COVID, that can be a potentially fatal thing. Again, the rule of law, I'll get back to this at the end, but the regulation aspect of this is going to, I think, actually stir the pot quite a bit, because the way that Europe trades with China, the way that Europe trades with the US in terms of AI talent and intellectual property, and even how do you tax data flow, all these things are huge implications. And then finally, the biggest problem, paradoxically, I think, is the anthropomorphization of AI. People still give it human attributes. It's from Rick and Morty, but it's like if you have a dog and you are buying it clothes, people are desperately trying to see the human side in AI. But what that leads to is, I've seen this European regulation going back to, I think, 2018, which said, everyone must ensure at all times that, and there will be commissions to kind of like make sure that this is being upheld, that the only AI that is being developed is moral and good. What does that mean? It's a set of algorithms, it's statistics. It's like saying, I don't like this calculator because it looked weird at me. Like, it's genuinely like that level of logic. But it's a huge problem because it's coming out of the Central European Union regulatory body. And that means that startups and innovation institutes are going to be affected by that, because suddenly they're only allowed to do their job if the AI that they get out of it is good and moral. Like, what is that? Like, you're regulating something that doesn't even exist. So again, interesting dimension. And one last thing, artificial intelligence has the very unfortunate symptom that it has a lot of like biological terms hidden in it. So the idea of intelligence in the first place, the fact that you've got neural networks, or the fact that you've got deep learning, all these things have very kind of cognitive connotations. As an evolutionary anthropologist, I can tell you now, we don't understand the human brain. We don't know the degree of which hormones have effect on it. We don't know how it's wired together. We don't know the like swarm intelligence, all these things. So the idea of replicating the blueprint of the human brain in an artificial form is utopistic. So again, just that kind of neurological or neuropsychological perspective, just to demystify AI that one bit further. So the AI around us will kind of not whiz through this, but it's basically when you see AI around you, it's usually automation or some form of prediction or some form of analysis. So an example of that can be mobility, so Tesla and autonomous driving, and it being able to recognize through a set of cameras and like literally the algorithm drawing a line around it, whether it's a grandmother or a tree, and whether you should sway the car or not. Cybersecurity, so making sure that your banking is safe and that you can see again, I'll share this presentation, so don't worry about memorizing everything, but so that you can, so that, for example, transactions are safe. Again, cryptocurrencies use artificial intelligence hugely in terms of cybersecurity. Companies like Avast or AVG have made an entire business out of that. Spam filtering. So the word spam actually comes from the Monty Python sketch. I'm not sure you know about spam, but the fact that you're not getting loads of spam is because there's certain parameters like the amount of pictures in the email, or whether it's an email address that you've interacted with before, or whether they have a warm IP address. And then Gmail will basically filter that out with some degree of accuracy. Sometimes you know that if the domain is, for example, old, or you haven't been using it enough, your email can go into spam, even though it's a perfectly legit email, but that's all on the basis of AI. Video is another one. So for example, deepfakes, this is a great one between Bezos and Musk. So deepfakes and like recognition of, for example, satellite imagery and like analyzing satellite imagery, all of that is things like machine vision that are analyzing the things on the ground. So for example, here you can see analysis of ports and like, for example, good building soil or where you should plant crops, and kind of saying, oh, this area has been dry for some time, you shouldn't probably plant there. Then that's an example of AI. Industry 4.0, I've already mentioned that. So for example, predictive maintenance in factories, or the creation of digital twins. So obviously you don't want to play around with your machine that costs 10 million euros. So you want to create a virtual simulated one where you can try various bits and bobs with it and not risk your boss killing you. And also biochemistry and medicine, now more than ever, this is very important. So the development of the COVID vaccine actually had a lot of machine learning methodology in it, where you predicted the effect it might have on people, or where you predicted the way that biochemically the different substances are going to interact with either your body or themselves, or for example, using robots in surgery. Matchmaking. So matchmaking, not only in the sense of Tinder, because they actually tried AI once to create a dating profile, and it went completely mental. And obviously, well, it didn't go mental because it doesn't understand what it's saying. It was just throwing random words out there like a parrot to hilarious effects. But it actually shows how dumb AI can really be. But the matchmaking in terms of, for example, matchmaking data. So like the recommendation engine, when you type something into Google, you probably rarely scroll past the fourth link, right? Well, that's not random. That's a recommendation algorithm telling you, oh, well, this probably has like 50% accuracy with what she's written in here, I'm going to recommend this, because otherwise the internet is so vast, you'd never ever be able to find anything. So one of the main reasons that Google made so much money and is making so much money is advertisements, because they're being very clearly recommended to you, but also because it's able to recommend information very, very accurately. Smart cities, I'm a huge fan of this. My whole idea is basically creating, on our analog world, creating a digital layer on which we can do sexy stuff with AI. So whether that's predicting where to build houses, or whether that's things like Skyscanner, so when there's cheap tickets and when there's not cheap tickets, but making all of these systems interact so that we live in a truly smart society is, I think, the future. And that actually brings us onto AI and our future. By the way, these little postcards, they're from Expo in Paris in the 1900, and it was what they thought humanity would look like in the year 2000. So some of it they got right, some of it they got hilariously wrong. But I think that transport and logistics is going to be, and the optimization of that is going to, so for example, the fact that like trains run on time or traffic is regulated. So things like Waze, all these things are, I think, going to be a big future of AI. Communication, the way that we talk to each other on the internet, the way that we create communities. Automatization, so the automation of manual tasks. I don't want to be doing my taxes. I mean, I don't want to be paying them, but I don't want to be doing them. I don't want to be filling in my insurance, like all these things that bother you. They're very easily automated. So I think that that's going to, imagine like if the state was automated from like 90%, which is easily doable. That I think is a nice world of AI in the future. Education. Imagine that you're talented in speaking, and someone else might be talented in writing, or someone might be more talented in history, someone in maths, and you're giving all those people identical curricula and identical homeworks. You're not going to get the most out of them. And with digitalizing education and personalizing content in very much the same way that Google does with its recommendation algorithms, you can get more out of kids, and they can actually enjoy school. And they can, in a world where you can do a PhD in physics from your couch just with the use of the internet, if you're motivated enough, I see no reason why AI can be applied in education in a bit more intelligent way as well. Relationships, they're already changing. The fact, I mean, I lived in the UK for a long time, so the fact that I was able to use, for example, WhatsApp, which uses AI for encryption, to talk securely with my family, that was a huge thing. I wouldn't be able to do that 10 years ago, let alone like 20 years ago. So relationships between people and communication is going to change drastically. Nature and our relationship with it. There's already, for example, AI being used in the interspecies project, where people are mapping the extinction of species and the rate of extinction, and deploying artificial intelligence and machine learning methods to optimize the way that we basically interact with nature, and not just like human versus nature, but actually understanding nature's data, understanding our data, and making sure that they can work together. I think creating this interspecies system is going to be a huge step forward. Industry and manufacturing, optimizing that, making sure that if the Suez Canal gets stuck, that we're ready for that eventuality, and that we have manufacturing and logistics that can handle that. And it's actually quite funny. I mean, if it wasn't so economically drastic, it would be hilarious that one ship getting stuck in a bit of sand can paralyze the entire world in the 21st century. It's these things that show that, yeah, we might have AI, but we're definitely not using it to its full potential. And this is probably the most important, interesting thing for me. This is, if you read Jules Verne, he was a great visionary and novelist. He wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is Captain Nemo. And the story is, in a nutshell, Captain Nemo being fed up with society and being hurt by it. So leaving the steam world of the Industrial Revolution behind, and being completely independent on his Nautilus, in generating electricity and being completely independent. Technology gives us that. Imagine the independence that you have when you can just move around freely with just the use of your phone and maybe your card, but probably not because you have the card on your phone. You can start a company, like, now, if you want to, any block time systemization, I'm kind of anarchist or revolutionary. It's just me being a archaeologist who's seen this happen many, many times in the past. And I think that we are coming to a civilizational change where smaller groups of people working together in a distributed way is much more effective than one massive institution trying to deal with all this innovation and all of this change, because it can't. An example of this is the Ministry of Industry here in the Czech Republic that was that recently, it was in 2018, and they created a PDF with about the state of AI in 2018. And by the time that they finished writing it, they needed to start all over again because the research happened so quickly. So don't be afraid of technologies, educate yourselves in them. Let's stay in touch and remember that the stone implement and the machine learning algorithm are not that different after all. Thank you very much. It's been an honor, and I'm of course open to questions.
Sarah, what a presentation. Wow, you took us on a historical journey and you help us understand the foundations of artificial intelligence. My question to you, I have one quick question, and I think I'll have to extend to the audience the opportunity to follow up to also access your presentation. But you talked early on about, of course, mathematics, computer science, all of these sort of influences, but the need for multidisciplinarity. And I wonder, in light of the garbage in factor, the bias in factor, the human factor that leads to bias in our algorithms, do you have a priority as you think about multidisciplinarity in terms of fields that need to be brought to the table as we advance AI?
Thank you. I, of course, have to declare an interest, a conflict of interest, because I think that evolutionary science and archaeology are actually very, very important. There is a example of a course that's been designed at Oxford lately, and I'm talking to them about it in the next few weeks, which is computer science and philosophy. And philosophy can be a bit wishy-washy, but when you actually study the logic of like Aristotle, it's very, very similar to the symbolic approach in AI. It's just an extension of that, basically. So I think philosophy is a great one. Linguistics as well. So people like Noam Chomsky or even de Saussure, the basics of linguistics are now actually informing the latest development in natural language processing, which is a part of machine learning. So I think that anthropology, both evolutionary and cultural, philosophy and linguistics are, for me, like the top ones to get involved.
You're muted, Dr. Washington.
We have one question in the chat. We'll let that be our final one. It has to do with recent Netflix documentaries, Coded Bias. It's about bias. Coded Bias, The Social Dilemma. Of course, there are a number of books that deal with social bias as well. What are your thoughts about this? And let's see, I don't know the specific question. What steps need to be taken to ensure that AI-based decisions don't increase inequality and bias due to the blind trust in the algorithms?
Great question. I will have, so I have a kind of like two-sided answer to this. One is that, of course, as much as I love Netflix myself, it feeds on sensationalism. The Social Dilemma, as well as Black Mirror, are presented as almost like the near future, or already what is happening. And I used to work in the digitalization of politics during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, who said that thanks to sophisticated use of AI and sentiment analysis, they were able to sway votes. Due to various NDAs, I can't go into that much information, but I didn't work for Cambridge Analytica. I was just in politics at the time and very close to various campaigns. And it's not true, because like you're not actually collecting data that is that sexy. You might scrape maybe like Twitter bios where someone says, I like the European Union and hot dogs, but what are you going to do with that? Like, you're going to send them a pamphlet with the European Union on, maybe, but like there's actually not that much like dark magic that you can do unless you're actually spying on someone, which yes is a possibility and yes has been done before. And what Edward Snowden, for example, spoke about, I think is a lot more eerie than the kind of Black Mirror edge or maybe the Social Dilemma edge that is being taken. So yes, these companies are collecting a lot of data. They sometimes sell it, or they're sometimes just incompetent and they leave it lying somewhere and people steal it. Like that's just happening. And so I think it's more a question of a lot of these big companies that now have monopolies have been founded by accident. Like Facebook was founded as a dating website, and it outgrew. I think I'm not saying that Zuckerberg is by any chance like a dumb person. He's extremely intelligent, but he wasn't born and he wasn't ready to create a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands and thousands of people there. And with the pace of development, what you're seeing happening is that the people who are in top management in these positions, sometimes they no longer keep up with the latest pace of innovation. So they're actually making strategic changes or strategic decisions that might not be the best informed ones. So I would be really careful to sway away from the kind of sensationalism of like they're controlling us or they have incredible control over us, because individuals are actually smarter than people think. We have 2 million years of evolution that shaped our brains, so we're not that dumb. And I think that a lot of the times we know what we're seeing is biased, but it just like gives a bit of dopamine, so we're happy with it and we're happy to replicate it because we're pissed off with our neighbors. So it's something that will get them going. However, what is true is that recommendation algorithms are built to make those companies money. So they're going to show you things that you want to see, and they are going to create content bubbles, which is why the multidisciplinarity, again, is important. Showing people that disagreeing with each other is important. Giving someone a safe space, for example, if someone, like, I was watching this from a distance, so I don't want to like throw a grenade into the chat, but for example, someone who votes for Trump should have the freedom and the kind of like ease of discussion to be able to come into a discussion with someone who voted for Joe Biden, and they should be able to have a civilized discussion about it. That's not happening right now because people are becoming almost like primitively tribalized. And what is then happening is that the recommendation algorithms are only learning from that behavior and are only keeping that like running and running because advertisement companies are making a lot of money out of that. So I think that creating safe space for discussion, creating a safe space for moderate, like critical thinking, and like not being able to say your opinion whilst referring to data that you can find on the internet, because everything's on the internet, is going to be the future. And again, the foundation of that is multidisciplinarity and education. So yeah, sorry, I hope I answered that question, but I'm happy to.
Well, you know, and I think you've given us a sort of a challenge as educators to create these safe spaces. Now, I was in a room, I'm going to close with this. I was in a room with Dekai and some other AI experts, and they recommended a number of books like Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence related to these notions of ethics. They Technically Wrong by Sara Buckner, and then Algorithms of Oppression. These are some of the books. Is there a book you might recommend to our audience to read if they want to learn more about AI and ethics?
I would actually, it's not a book, but I would advise I'll write it in the chat. It's Tomáš Mikolov. He used to be in Google Brain, and he did the Word to Vec. So it's not a book, but he does do a lot of popularization. He talks a lot about the true principles of how machine learning works. Something like the Algorithms of Oppression. It's a very interesting book, but it's the same that like Indiana Jones is for archaeologists. Like, yes, it gets people going. Yes, it's interesting. Yes, it gives a lot of food for thought, but it doesn't necessarily always reflect the way that machine learning research happens in practice. So I would actually advise going to researchers that don't think of ethics, but they don't think of them because they're evil people, but they just think purely about the technology to see how the technological principles work. And then with that in mind, reading a book like Algorithms of Oppression to be able to have that technological foundation on which to critically be able to take in that information. I think that's a better direction than the other way around. So this is something that I would recommend. And again, I'm more than happy to share maybe more resources post hoc with you, Dr. Washington, via email.
I'm going to take the information you share with us and the questions that were asked in the chat. I'll present to you in a different way, and then we'll follow up in our through our leadership center with this information. Any closing thought for us, Sara?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I am really humbled and honored that I could do this talk. I have this massive imposter syndrome that I'm basically just like a girl who enjoys ancient Egypt and robots and is suddenly invited to talk at a university of your stature. So it's a great honor. And for me, I don't want to just do like a flash in the pan panel discussions. I really want to create a global, I want to walk the walk. I want to create a community of like-minded people where we can evolve these ideas and like be on one platform and talk. And even if we can't see each other face to face, that we can at least keep the ideas going without a pressure of being a startup at the end of it. So I'd encourage everyone to stay in touch, and maybe we can make something cool together.
Well, Sarah, I consider you a friend. You're a treasury of fellowship, and today you've been a university of knowledge about AI. So you're not faking it. You're the real deal, and we appreciate having you. Thank you so much for sharing your gift with us today. Please join me in expressing your appreciation, folks, to Sarah for her wonderful presentation today. And Sarah, we will certainly be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes our presentation today, folks. Stay tuned. We have more talented, gifted intellectuals who will be sharing more topics about how our world is changing. So thank you.